So today I'm here to talk about why history was removed out of the curriculum in African schools. Why was it taken out of our syllabus in African schools? History is a very wonderful study. It's a wonderful discipline and one of the most important for anybody in life. If you understand history, you understand life. But then, why was history taken, especially the study of African history? Remember, for a very long time, Eurocentric writers posited that Africans did not have history until they came in contact with Europeans. For these Eurocentric writers, they believed that history was about documenting. And so when they arrived at the African continent, they didn't find written materials and so concluded that Africans did not have any history. And the only history that Africans had was the one that began with our contact with Europe. Now, why would we believe such a lie? Looking at African history very well, one will understand that if we want to take African history as one that began with the contact with Europe, then African history would be beginning from the history of slavery, then going to legitimate trade after the abolition of slavery, then colonialism, then neo-colonialism. But we cannot subscribe to that because African history began before then. We don't know people living in Africa before they arrived. Of course, there were people living in Africa before the Europeans arrived. So do you want to say that these people did not have any history? They did not have mythology, stories, the way of life, things they believe, the religious systems, their different way of life, culture, their practices. You want to say they did not have a particular way they were living before the Europeans arrived, and that now we have to judge our history based on the documentation of the white man? Of course not. What is funny is that when you look at the Europeans who were saying these things, they themselves had history that were documented by oral tradition. When I say oral tradition, words of mouth. When you look at Homer is a very highly respected poet in the European continent, and he documented two works. One is the Iliad and the other is the Odyssey. These works were actually gotten by oral tradition. Now, if these works were gotten by oral tradition and still regarded and highly revered as very credible works, why then would we discard African history when in Africa we had a whole lot of oral traditions? In different cultures in Africa, they had oral traditions, they had their own creation myths, they had their different superstitions, and they had these things by word of mouth of which they passed down from generation to generation to generation. But still, the white man knowing these things, or the Eurocentric writers knowing these things, still chose to discard that Africans did not have any history until they came in contact with the Europeans. Now, look at something now. We have early writers like Leo Frobenius. Leo Frobenius is a German ethnologist and archaeologist. Ethnologists are people that deal with cultures, the norms, the values of different cultural settings. And so Leo Frobenius wrote a whole lot of documents, written documents on the African continent. He visited Africa, he visited Western Africa also, and then he made a whole lot of credible writings, of which, in spite of these writings, these Eurocentric writers still continue to conclude that Africa was a dark continent. Now, for this reason, I think not only Leo Frobenius was the one that wrote, Maurice de la Fosse wrote, Arturo Labriola, even Ibn Khaldun. And so, when you look at most of these Afrocentric writers, I would like to call them, that documented on Africa, despite their works, their early works, Eurocentric writers still chose to discard them. But why is the question that I still often ask. Now, here's the answer now. Why did they say so? When you look at African history, if it began with the Europeans and then the European history began with slavery, then it simply means that you are simply going to disconnect Africans from the history that came before slavery. What was that history? Our ancient history. Ancient African civilization, which is the pre-slavery and pre-colonial history, is so rich. It is so rich and very enlightening that if every African today go back and read about our ancient life, they will be so surprised and ask themselves why they did not know about these things. We had different beliefs, we had our ways of life, of which with the ones that we actually inherited from the colonial masters are very similar and even probably are more superior to the ones we inherited. But Africans are not aware of these things. And so because we do not know our roots, like Marcus Garvey echoed, he said, a people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without its roots. And so Africans these days that are living are like trees without a root. Now, how can a tree stand without its roots? Which is actually a very good question. And so if all you know about your continent is slavery and colonialism, these two events that were exploitative in nature, these two events of which, when we recall these events, more of what we get from these events are how Africans were mistreated. If these two stories, these two events are more like the main history that we continue to echo and we continue to sing and chorus and parrot to every African around, then what do you think that kind of history would give birth to? It would give birth to a demoralized generation, a people without identity, people with inferior complex, because they have been told that at one period in time they were mistreated, they were humiliated by a certain race, and so they internalize those stories and then accept it as their own fate, which is not right. And so for this reason, it is important that we bring African history in. African history in Nigeria, let me use Nigeria as a case study. History was introduced in Africa around 1887 with the Education Ordinance at that period in time. Now, when this history came, this history did not emphasize on Africans themselves, because the history was introduced by the European education system. So the Europeans introduced this history into our studies, but more of the history of Europeans. And so you begin to see stories of how they tell you about the Greeks, the Romans, the achievements of the Europeans. Barely did they emphasize or bring into light Africans' achievements prior to their contact with Europeans. Do you know why? If you tell these people that they were once a great people, and they go and find out that it's true that they were once great, then you see they will become a threat to your existence. And so hence you have to emphasize that you have always been great since time immemorial, and then you are still great, and that is why you are subduing them at that period in time. 1887, most African countries had begun to come under colonial rule after the 1884-1885 Berlin Conference that led to the scramble for Africa. And so, with emphasis on European history, it meant that Africans themselves were more and more disconnected from their history. Walter Rodney said something in his 6th chapter, chapter 6, in how Europe underdeveloped Africa. I think he was talking about education as an instrument for underdevelopment. And so he said something. He said, prior to Africans' contact with Europe, something about Africans was this. Africans understood their environment very well, and that education was one that meant that people could use it in order for them to survive, in order for them to be able to tackle their immediate circumstances. He gave an example, I think, of the Bemba people. If I can remember correctly, he talked about from a very young age, the kids could tell you about the very many trees and plants in their environment. These things they knew offhand because they were educated in these things firsthand. You understand? But when they came in contact with the Europeans, it was a different case. They were now told more about European history, about the history of Queen Elizabeth. They were told about the history of Greece. They were told about Socrates, about Herodotus, about Isocrates, about Pythagoras, about Aristotle. All of these European figures. They were really told about African figures that existed. They were not told about the Egyptian civilization. They were not told that Africans had a writing system like hieroglyphics. They were not told that it was Africans that made the Great Walls of Zimbabwe. Africans were not told about the stone at Namora-Tunga. Africans were not told about the obelisks at the Horn of Africa. Africans were not told about the great Benin Empire, that even when the white men came, they marveled at such civilization. Africans were not told about these things, but more often than not, European history was glorified in their eyes. And so gradually, these kids were disconnected from their roots and then reconnected to something that was unfamiliar, something unhelpful, something that was not necessary for their survival. So now the big question is this: why now was history taken out of syllabus? Some people posit that history was taken out of our syllabus because due to a conspiracy among the IMF and the World Bank. They claim that there is no subject, no discipline in education that talks about African history like history does, not social studies, not civic education, these studies of which were used as alternatives to replace history, still could not tell history like history did. And so philosophy was often discouraged by the IMF and the World Bank. History was discouraged, as well as theater and arts and most of these cultural studies, of which were known to be instruments for enlightening and inspiring and educating people. And so they posit that the reason why history was taken out of the syllabus was for that reason. And that another thing is this: when you look at African history very well, slavery and colonialism, those two events of which marked the beginning of our contact with Europe, these events have not been properly analyzed. These events are very expository if dug deep into. But how often do we dig deep into it is another thing. Most people that know about slavery and colonialism in Africa today cannot even give you detailed narration of these events, the nuances in these events. They do not really know these things. And social studies nor civic education can tell you these things like history will tell you. Why? Because history does not only narrate, history critics. History is philosophy with example, says Thucydides. And it simply means that if you study history, you will not only read these stories, but you will read these stories alongside other stories and comparatively analyze these stories. Meaning what? You begin to question these things. And what does questioning do? Questioning leads you to realization. And once you realize, you're a free man. This is why history was taken away from our syllabus. Another school of thought posits that history was taken out of syllabus because the ruling elites in Africa here did not want people to question their past history. It simply means that when a ruler ruled, what historians do is after they document it, they critically write these things and then they analyze these things and look the failures and the successes of any particular ruler. But in Africa, you barely see people even analyze the role of Africans. Have you not observed that we've barely had debates where we talk about if a particular ruler during his tenure outdid a particular ruler and what were his successes? Did he make compromises? Was he a sellout? Was he a planted puppet in the African administration? And so they took history out of our syllabus because this history discipline would enable people question these things and see through these things. Therefore, subsequently, making sure that they hold leaders to accountability, which is something that leaders do not like, especially African politicians. And so history was taken out of our syllabus for those reasons. Now, by 1983 in Nigeria, history became very relegated. History that was introduced by the white man, even though it was Eurocentric in nature, by 1983, it had been relegated from Nigerian history. And then by 2009 to 2010, history was totally scrapped and then taken away from the syllabus and replaced in the primary and secondary level with social studies and civic education. And in the secondary level, it was replaced with government. No matter how much government still gives certain details and is packaged with knowledge, government can still not equate to history. As history is encompassing, history will tell you about the things that government tells you. We tell you about the things that social studies and civic education tells you, and still gives you more than any other field will give to you. And so by 2009, 2010, it was taken away out of African history. But thankfully, 2017 it has been revived back in Nigerian history, which is something that is very commendable. I'm hoping that we will begin to look at our own history and analyze this history. I need to give a very big accolade to many of African historians that have actually put in effort to give us African history. When you look at the general history of Africa that's as put together by UNESCO, it comprised of a whole lot of African historians who saw the necessity to give us the detailed history of Africa. And so we're able to give us a solid compilation of 8 volumes of African history. If you're ever free, you can go ahead and look it up, maybe in any of the libraries, and you will see a whole lot of expositions in there. African history is very beautiful, and we shall analyze these things and talk about these wonderful things. We shall begin to put side by side all the past leaders and their rules, and we shall critique them and analyze them, their successes and their failures. Just like I once said in one of my rap lines, Gaddafi or Gowon, who was a better head of state? As the both of them were known to rule around similar periods, even though Gaddafi ruled Libya and Gowon was ruling Nigeria, we would comparatively analyze these two rules and see where did each fall. And then we can learn from the mistakes of our ancestors, learn from the mistakes of the past rule, and try not to repeat these things. For people who lack the knowledge of history, tend to repeat the same mistakes that their forebearers did make. So history is very important, and we shall get there. So I'll see you next time.